Hey there, fellow plant lovers, and welcome back to Botanic Haven. I'm so glad you're here with me today because we're diving into something that honestly changed the way I think about growing plants. This channel is all about gardening, plant care, and creating those beautiful green spaces both inside your home and out in your yard. Whether you've got a tiny apartment balcony or a sprawling backyard, we're here to help you make it thrive. And today I want to share something really special with you, a trick that's going to make your plants grow 3 times faster without using a single chemical. I know that sounds almost too good to be true, but stick with me because I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works, why it works, and how you can start using it in your own garden right away. So let me start by telling you a little story. A few years ago, I had this friend named Daisy who was absolutely obsessed with her tomato plants. She'd spend hours every weekend tending to them, watering them perfectly, making sure they got just the right amount of sun. But every season her plants would grow so slowly. They'd eventually produce tomatoes, sure, but it would take forever, and by the time they were ready, half the growing season was already over. She tried everything: different fertilizers, fancy watering schedules, even talking to her plants like some people swear by. Nothing seemed to make a real difference. Then one day she stumbled across this old technique that her grandmother used to use back in the day, and everything changed. Within weeks, her tomato plants were growing like crazy. The stems got thicker, the leaves turned this vibrant deep green, and she was harvesting tomatoes way earlier than she ever had before. When she told me about it, I was skeptical at first, but then I tried it myself, and I was blown away by the results. The secret behind this incredible growth isn't some newfangled invention or expensive product you have to order online. It's actually something that's been used for generations by gardeners who understood how nature really works. What we're talking about here is compost tea. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, compost tea, I've heard of that. But hear me out, because there's a specific way to make it and use it that really maximizes its effectiveness. Compost tea is basically liquid gold for your plants. It's packed with beneficial microorganisms, nutrients, and all sorts of natural compounds that plants absolutely love. When you apply it correctly, it doesn't just feed your plants, it actually transforms the soil ecosystem around their roots, creating this thriving environment where plants can absorb nutrients more efficiently and grow at an accelerated rate. Let me explain why this works so well. You see, plants don't just need food in the form of nutrients. They also need a healthy soil ecosystem with beneficial bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that help break down organic matter and make nutrients available in a form that plant roots can actually absorb. Chemical fertilizers can provide nutrients, sure, but they don't do anything to support that underground ecosystem. In fact, they can sometimes harm it. Compost tea, on the other hand, introduces millions of beneficial microbes directly to your soil. These little helpers work around the clock to improve soil structure, suppress harmful pathogens, and create a symbiotic relationship with your plant roots. The result is plants that grow faster, stronger, and more resilient to disease and stress. Now, making compost tea is actually pretty simple, and you don't need any fancy equipment to get started. Here's what I do, and this method has worked wonderfully for me and countless other gardeners I've shared it with. First, you're going to need good quality compost. This is really important because the better your compost, the more diverse and beneficial the microorganisms will be in your tea. You want compost that's well-aged, dark, and crumbly, with a nice earthy smell. If your compost smells bad or looks slimy, it's not ready yet. You'll also need a bucket. I like using a 5-gallon bucket because it's a good size for most home gardens. Make sure it's clean and hasn't been used for anything that might have chemical residues. Then you'll need some dechlorinated water. If you have chlorinated tap water, just let it sit out in an open container for 24 hours before using it, and the chlorine will evaporate. Chlorine can kill the beneficial microbes we're trying to cultivate, so this step is important. Now, making compost tea is actually pretty simple, and you don't need any fancy equipment to get started. Here's what I do, and this method has worked wonderfully for me and countless other gardeners I've shared it with. First, you're going to need good quality compost. This is really important because the better your compost, the more diverse and beneficial the microorganisms will be in your tea. You want compost that's well-aged, dark, and crumbly, with a nice earthy smell. If your compost smells bad or looks slimy, it's not ready yet. You'll also need a bucket. I like using a 5-gallon bucket because it's a good size for most home gardens. Make sure it's clean and hasn't been used for anything that might have chemical residues. Then you'll need some dechlorinated water. If you have chlorinated tap water, just let it sit out in an open container for 24 hours before using it, and the chlorine will evaporate. Chlorine can kill the beneficial microbes we're trying to cultivate, so this step is important. Here's how you put it all together. Fill your bucket about 3/4 full with your dechlorinated water. Then take about 2 to 3 cups of your finished compost and put it in the water. Some people like to use a cloth bag or an old pillowcase to hold the compost so it's easier to remove later. But honestly, you can just put it directly in the water if you don't mind straining it afterward. Now comes the important part, aeration. You need to keep oxygen flowing through this mixture because the beneficial microbes we want are aerobic, meaning they need oxygen to thrive. The easiest way to do this is with an aquarium air pump and air stone, the same kind you'd use in a fish tank. Drop the air stone into the bucket, plug in the pump, and let it bubble away. If you don't have an aquarium pump, you can manually stir the mixture vigorously several times a day, but the pump makes life a lot easier and gives you better results. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Alright, so once you've got your compost tea brewing with that air pump running, you're going to let it sit for about 24 to 36 hours. During this time, those beneficial microorganisms are multiplying like crazy. You'll notice the water starts to develop a rich, earthy smell. Not unpleasant at all, just earthy. If it starts to smell bad, like sulfur or rotten eggs, that means it's gone anaerobic and you need to start over with more aeration. But if you're using the air pump, this rarely happens. After your tea has brewed for a day or so, it's ready to use. You want to use it fairly quickly, ideally within a few hours of turning off the air pump, because once the oxygen supply stops, some of those beneficial microbes will start to die off. When it's time to apply your compost tea, there are 2 main methods you can use, and I actually recommend doing both for maximum benefit. The first method is soil drenching. This is where you pour the compost tea directly onto the soil around your plants. This delivers those beneficial microorganisms and nutrients right to the root zone, where they can get to work immediately. I like to dilute my compost tea about 50-50 with water for soil drenching, just to make sure I'm not overwhelming the plants and to make my tea go further. Pour it around the base of each plant, making sure to cover the entire root zone. You'll want to use about a quart or so per plant, depending on the size. For smaller plants like herbs or lettuce, a cup or 2 is plenty. For larger plants like tomatoes or peppers, you can use a quart or even more. The second method is foliar spraying, which means spraying the compost tea directly onto the leaves of your plants. This might seem odd at first, but plants can actually absorb nutrients and beneficial microbes through their leaves, and foliar feeding can produce incredibly fast results. For foliar spraying, you definitely want to strain your compost tea through a fine mesh or cheesecloth to remove any larger particles that might clog your sprayer. Then dilute it a bit more than you would for soil drenching. I usually do about 1 part compost tea to 3 parts water for spraying. Use a pump sprayer or even just a spray bottle for smaller gardens and mist your plants thoroughly, making sure to get both the tops and undersides of the leaves. The undersides are especially important because that's where a lot of nutrient absorption happens through the leaf pores. I remember when my neighbour Oliver first tried this foliar spraying technique on his struggling basil plants. They'd been looking pretty sad, with yellowing leaves and stunted growth, and he was about ready to give up on them. But after just 1 application of compost tea spray, followed by another application a week later, those basil plants completely transformed. The leaves went from pale and droopy to this gorgeous, vibrant green, and the plants practically doubled in size within 2 weeks. He was so amazed that he started using compost tea on everything in his garden, and now he's got the most productive vegetable garden on our whole street. It's pretty incredible what this simple technique can do. Now let's talk about timing and frequency, because this is something a lot of people ask me about. How often should you apply compost tea to get these amazing results? Well, it depends a bit on what you're growing and what stage your plants are in, but as a general rule, I recommend applying compost tea every 2 weeks during the active growing season. This keeps a steady supply of beneficial microorganisms and nutrients flowing to your plants without overdoing it. When plants are young and actively growing, they can really benefit from more frequent applications, so you might even do it once a week. But once they're more established, every 2 weeks is perfect. For foliar sprays, early morning or late evening is the best time to apply because the stomata on the leaves are open during these times, which means better absorption. Plus, you avoid the risk of the sun burning the leaves through water droplets. One thing I want to emphasize is that compost tea isn't just about the nutrients, though those are definitely important. The real magic happens because of those living microorganisms. When you introduce billions of beneficial bacteria and fungi to your soil, they create this entire underground ecosystem that works in harmony with your plants. These microbes help break down organic matter in the soil, releasing nutrients that would otherwise be locked up and unavailable. They also produce enzymes and hormones that stimulate plant growth and help plants develop stronger, more extensive root systems. A plant with a robust root system can access more water and nutrients, which translates directly to faster growth and better overall health. There's also this fascinating relationship between certain soil fungi and plant roots called mycorrhizal association. These beneficial fungi form partnerships with plant roots, extending the root's reach far beyond what the plant could achieve on its own. The fungi help the plant access water and nutrients, especially phosphorus, while the plant provides the fungi with sugars produced through photosynthesis. It's a win-win situation, and compost tea can help establish and maintain these beneficial fungal networks in your soil. Over time, as you continue to use compost tea, you're building a more resilient, self-sustaining soil ecosystem that will support healthy plant growth year after year. Let me share another quick story that really drives this point home. I have a friend named Rose who grows flowers for local farmers markets, and she's always looking for ways to produce more blooms without relying on synthetic chemicals. She started using compost tea on her flower beds about 3 years ago, and the difference has been night and day. Her zinnias, which used to take weeks to really get going, now shoot up faster than she ever thought possible. Her dahlias produce more blooms and the colours are more vibrant. But here's the really interesting part. She's noticed that her plants are also much more resistant to diseases and pests. She used to have problems with powdery mildew on her zinnias every single year, but since she started using compost tea, especially as a foliar spray, she hardly sees any disease at all. That's because those beneficial microbes on the leaf surfaces actually outcompete and suppress the harmful pathogens that cause disease. This brings up an important point about disease suppression. When you spray compost tea on your plants, you're essentially coating the leaves with a protective layer of beneficial organisms. These good guys take up all the available space and resources on the leaf surface, leaving no room for the bad guys to establish themselves. It's like having a security team guarding your plants 24/7. This natural form of disease prevention is so much better than using chemical fungicides because it doesn't harm the environment, it doesn't leave residues on your food, and it actually improves the overall health of your plants rather than just treating symptoms. Now, I want to address some common mistakes people make when using compost tea, because getting these details right can make the difference between amazing results and mediocre ones. The first mistake is using chlorinated water without letting it dechlorinate first. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating because it's such a common oversight. Chlorine will kill the beneficial microbes in your compost tea, defeating the whole purpose. Always let your tap water sit out for at least 24 hours before using it, or use rainwater if you have it available. Rainwater is actually ideal because it's naturally free of chlorine and other chemicals, plus it has a slightly acidic pH that plants love. The second mistake is not aerating the tea properly or long enough. Remember, those beneficial microbes need oxygen to multiply and thrive. If your tea goes anaerobic, you'll end up with harmful bacteria instead of helpful ones, and you could actually harm your plants rather than help them. That's why using an aquarium pump is so important. It keeps the oxygen levels high throughout the brewing process. And make sure you're brewing for the right amount of time. 24 to 36 hours is the sweet spot. Less than that and you won't have enough microbial growth. More than 48 hours and you start to run into issues with oxygen depletion and declining microbial populations. Another mistake is using poor quality compost to make your tea. Your compost tea can only be as good as the compost you start with. If you're using compost that's not fully finished or that was made incorrectly and has a lot of harmful bacteria, that's what you'll be multiplying and spreading to your plants. Good compost should smell earthy and pleasant, have a crumbly texture, and be dark brown or black in color. If you're not sure about the quality of your compost, it's better to buy a small bag of high-quality compost from a garden center specifically for making tea, even if you use your homemade compost for other purposes. Let me tell you about a gardener I know named Ivy who learned this lesson the hard way. She was so excited to try compost tea that she rushed into it without really checking her compost first. She grabbed some material from her compost pile that wasn't quite finished yet. It still had visible food scraps and hadn't broken down completely. She made her tea with it and applied it to her pepper plants. And within a few days she noticed some of her plants weren't looking right. They had some yellowing and seemed stressed. What happened was that her unfinished compost had some harmful bacteria in it that got multiplied during the brewing process. Once she figured out the problem, she started over with properly finished compost and the next batch of tea worked perfectly. Her plants recovered quickly and went on to produce an amazing harvest. So please learn from Ivy's mistake and make sure you're starting with good material. Let's talk about some variations and additions you can make to your basic compost tea to supercharge it even further. While plain compost tea is fantastic on its own, you can add a few simple ingredients to give those microbes extra food and help them multiply even faster. One of my favorite additions is unsulfured molasses. Just add about a tablespoon of molasses per gallon of water to your tea when you start brewing. The molasses provides sugars that feed the bacteria, helping them multiply rapidly. This creates an even more concentrated tea with even more beneficial microorganisms. You can find unsulfured molasses at most grocery stores in the baking aisle, and one bottle will last you a long time. Another great addition is kelp meal or liquid kelp. Kelp is loaded with trace minerals, growth hormones, and other beneficial compounds that plants absolutely love. Add a tablespoon or two of kelp meal to your compost tea brew. Or if you're using liquid kelp, follow the instructions on the bottle for dilution rates. The kelp not only provides extra nutrition for your plants, but also feeds the beneficial microbes in your tea. I've found that adding kelp makes a noticeable difference in plant vigor and stress resistance. My friend Lucas swears by kelp-enhanced compost tea for his vegetable garden, and his plants always look incredibly healthy and productive. You can also add fish hydrolysate or fish emulsion to your compost tea for an extra nitrogen boost. This is especially good for leafy greens and other plants that need a lot of nitrogen for vegetative growth. Just be aware that fish products can make your tea smell a bit stronger, still earthy but definitely more pungent. I usually reserve fish-enhanced tea for outdoor use rather than houseplants just because of the smell, but the results are worth it. Your plants will respond with lush, green growth and impressive vigor. Some people like to add worm castings to their compost tea as well, and this is a fantastic addition if you have access to high-quality castings. Worm castings are incredibly rich in beneficial microbes and nutrients, and they can really boost the effectiveness of your tea. You can use them in place of some of your compost or add them in addition to it. I usually use about a cup of worm castings per 5-gallon bucket of tea when I'm making a special batch for my most prized plants. The results are always impressive. Now let's talk about using compost tea for specific types of plants because different plants have different needs and you can tailor your approach accordingly. For vegetables like tomatoes, peppers and cucumbers, compost tea is absolutely fantastic. These are heavy feeders that really benefit from regular applications of nutrients and beneficial microbes. I apply compost tea to my vegetable garden every 2 weeks throughout the growing season, and I always see dramatically faster growth compared to when I don't use it. Tomatoes in particular seem to love compost tea. They develop thicker stems, more prolific root systems, and they set fruit earlier and more abundantly. The same goes for peppers and eggplants. These nightshade family plants really thrive with regular compost tea applications. For leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, and kale, compost tea is perfect for promoting that lush, rapid leaf growth that makes for great harvests. These plants benefit especially from the nitrogen in compost tea, and you'll notice that your greens grow faster, have deeper green color, and taste better too. I've had gardening friends tell me that their lettuce grown with compost tea has a sweeter, more complex flavor than lettuce grown with synthetic fertilizers. That makes sense when you think about it because the plants are getting a full spectrum of nutrients and beneficial compounds rather than just simple NPK. Root vegetables like carrots, beets and radishes also respond well to compost tea, though you want to be a bit more careful not to overdo it with nitrogen-rich amendments. Too much nitrogen can cause these plants to put all their energy into leaf growth rather than root development. For root crops, I stick with plain compost tea without adding extra fish emulsion or other high nitrogen amendments. The balanced nutrition from straight compost tea is perfect for encouraging healthy root development while still supporting good top growth. Flowering plants and herbs absolutely love compost tea too. For flowers, regular applications can lead to more abundant blooms, brighter colours, and longer flowering periods. Roses in particular are famous for being heavy feeders, and they respond incredibly well to compost tea. If you're growing roses, try giving them a good dose of compost tea every 2 weeks during the growing season, and you'll be amazed at how many more blooms you get. For herbs like basil, oregano, thyme, and cilantro, compost tea promotes vigorous growth and more intense flavors. There's something about the complex nutrition from compost tea that seems to enhance the essential oils in herbs, making them more aromatic and flavorful. Let me share one more story that really illustrates the power of this technique. I know a community gardener who manages plots for about 20 different families, and he was struggling with inconsistent results across the different plots. Some families' plants would thrive while others would struggle, even though they were all in the same garden with the same soil and conditions. He realized that the difference often came down to how people were fertilizing and caring for their plots. Some people used chemical fertilizers, some used organic amendments, and some didn't fertilize much at all. He decided to run an experiment. He got all 20 families to agree to use compost tea as their primary fertilizer for one growing season, and he taught them all how to make and apply it properly. Let me share one more story that really illustrates the power of this technique. I know a community gardener who manages plots for about 20 different families, and he was struggling with inconsistent results across the different plots. Some families' plants would thrive while others would struggle, even though they were all in the same garden with the same soil and conditions. He realized that the difference often came down to how people were fertilizing and caring for their plots. Some people used chemical fertilizers, some used organic amendments, and some didn't fertilize much at all. He decided to run an experiment. He got all 20 families to agree to use compost tea as their primary fertilizer for one growing season, and he taught them all how to make and apply it properly. The results were remarkable. By the end of the season, all 20 plots were producing abundantly, and the variation between plots had decreased dramatically. Everyone was harvesting more vegetables, dealing with fewer pest and disease problems, and the overall soil health in the garden had improved noticeably. Let me share one more story that really illustrates the power of this technique. I know a community gardener who manages plots for about 20 different families, and he was struggling with inconsistent results across the different plots. Some families' plants would thrive while others would struggle, even though they were all in the same garden with the same soil and conditions. He realized that the difference often came down to how people were fertilizing and caring for their plots. Some people used chemical fertilizers, some used organic amendments, and some didn't fertilize much at all. He decided to run an experiment. He got all 20 families to agree to use compost tea as their primary fertilizer for one growing season, and he taught them all how to make and apply it properly. The results were remarkable. By the end of the season, all 20 plots were producing abundantly, and the variation between plots had decreased dramatically. Everyone was harvesting more vegetables, dealing with fewer pest and disease problems, and the overall soil health in the garden had improved noticeably. This experience really drove home for him that compost tea isn't just about feeding plants. It's about creating a healthy, balanced growing environment where plants can reach their full potential naturally. When everyone in the garden was using the same approach based on natural soil biology rather than synthetic inputs, the entire garden ecosystem became more balanced and productive. That's the kind of transformation that gets me excited about gardening and why I'm so passionate about sharing these techniques with all of you. So let's talk about making compost tea a regular part of your gardening routine, because consistency is really key to seeing those amazing results. I recommend setting aside a specific day every 2 weeks during the growing season as your compost tea day. For me, that's Sunday mornings. I get up, have my coffee, and while I'm enjoying my morning, I set up my compost tea brew. I let it bubble away for about 24 hours, and then Monday evening after work, I apply it to my garden. This routine ensures that I never forget to make it, and my plants get regular, consistent applications throughout the season. Find a schedule that works for you and stick with it. Your plants will thank you with explosive growth and abundant harvests. It's also worth keeping notes about your compost tea applications and the results you see. I keep a simple garden journal where I jot down when I apply compost tea, what plants I treat, and any observations about growth, flowering, or fruiting. Over time, you'll start to see patterns and figure out exactly what works best for your specific garden conditions. Maybe you'll discover that your tomatoes respond better to weekly applications, while your peppers do fine with every 2 weeks. Or perhaps you'll notice that adding kelp to your tea makes a bigger difference for some plants than others. These observations will help you fine-tune your approach and get even better results year after year. One question I get asked a lot is whether you can overdo it with compost tea. Can you apply it too often or use too much? The short answer is that it's pretty hard to harm your plants with compost tea because it's such a gentle, balanced fertilizer. Unlike chemical fertilizers that can burn plants if you use too much, compost tea is much more forgiving. That said, there's not much point in applying it more than once a week because the beneficial microbes take time to establish themselves in the soil and do their work. Weekly applications during peak growing season is about the maximum frequency that makes sense. Beyond that, you're just wasting time and materials without seeing additional benefits. As for using too much at one time, again, it's hard to overdo it, but there's a point of diminishing returns. Drenching your soil with gallons and gallons of compost tea isn't going to give you better results than using a reasonable amount. For most garden plants, a quart per plant every 2 weeks is perfect. For larger plants or plants in containers, you might use a bit more, but you don't need to go overboard. The microbes will multiply and spread on their own once they're established in your soil. So you're just maintaining their populations with regular applications, not trying to saturate everything all at once. Now, I want to address a question that some of you might be wondering about. What about store-bought compost tea products? You've probably seen them at garden centres, bottles of concentrated liquid compost tea, or packages of microbial inoculants that claim to provide the same benefits. Are these products worth it? Well, they can be convenient if you don't have the time or resources to brew your own tea, but honestly, nothing beats freshly brewed compost tea made from quality compost. Those store-bought products have been sitting on shelves for who knows how long, and many of the beneficial microbes will have died off by the time you use them. Plus, they're usually quite expensive for what you get. Making your own compost tea is incredibly cheap. Basically just the cost of compost and a bit of electricity to run the air pump, and you get a fresh, living product that's teeming with beneficial organisms. If you do decide to try a commercial product, look for ones that are specifically labelled as containing live, beneficial microorganisms, and that have been stored properly. Avoid products that have been sitting in hot garden centres for months, and definitely avoid anything that claims to be compost tea but is really just liquid fertilizer without the microbial component. The microbes are what make this technique so effective, so don't settle for inferior products. Let me wrap up with some final thoughts and encouragement. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for sticking with me. I know I've covered a lot of information, but I really wanted to give you everything you need to succeed with this incredible technique. Compost tea has genuinely transformed my gardening experience, and I've seen it do the same for countless other gardeners. It's one of those rare things that seems too good to be true, but actually delivers on its promises. Your plants really will grow faster, healthier, and more productive when you use compost tea regularly. And the best part is that you're doing it all naturally without any synthetic chemicals or harmful additives. I encourage you to start small if you're new to this. Make one batch of compost tea and try it on a few of your plants. Watch what happens over the next few weeks. I'm confident you'll be amazed by the results, and then you'll want to expand the practice to your entire garden. Don't be intimidated by the process. It's really quite simple once you get the hang of it, and it becomes second nature after you've done it a few times. Remember, gardening is all about experimenting, learning, and finding what works best for your unique situation. Compost tea is a fantastic tool to have in your gardening toolkit, but it's also just one piece of the puzzle. continue learning, trying new things, and most importantly, enjoying the process of nurturing your plants and watching them thrive. If you found this information helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Botanic Haven so you don't miss future gardening tips and techniques. I love hearing from you all in the comments, so please share your experiences with compost tea, let me know what plants you're growing, and tell me what topics you'd like me to cover in future videos. There's such an amazing community of plant lovers here, and I'm grateful to be part of it with you. Until next time, happy gardening, and may all your plants grow strong and healthy.